Welcome to, sorry, I just got an error. That was supposed to be smooth and it was not. Welcome to Keys to AWS Optimization, the show where we tell you all of the secrets to unlock cost optimization at AWS. My name is Savannah Jensen. I am a senior FinOps success manager based out of Seattle on the optics team. And I have two of my lovely teammates with me today. Incredibly exciting. Jeff B as in Bloom. Would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yes, my name's Jeff Bloom. I work as a senior optimization solutions architect on the optics team. I'm based out of Nashville, Tennessee, and I've been with AWS for roughly 4.5 years in total now. Other Jeff D, you want to go?
Hey, Jeff Doreski. I'm a senior FinOps commercial architect based out of the Northern Virginia, DC area. Been with AWS about a year now. Just hit my year mark a couple weeks ago.
Every time everybody has like a AWS anniversary, I just feel old. Like you just started yesterday. What are you talking about? That was like 2 days ago.
You hit 5 years this year, right?
Yeah.
LinkedIn post went viral.
Oh no, don't remind me. That was really stressful. How are you both doing on this fine Thursday?
Doing well. Ready to talk about FinOps and stakeholders.
Awesome. So today we are going to be talking about how to communicate costs to different folks within a company and kind of discussing who you might be talking to if you're talking about FinOps. And folks in the chat, if you have any opinions about that, if you have any thoughts, or if you just want to share your role, please go ahead and drop them in. But Jeff D or Jeff B. Now I'm really throwing y'all for a loop here. Sorry about that. Do either of you want to kick us off by kind of walking through a couple of the personas and talking about who's usually involved in these discussions?
I'll defer to you, Jeff. Why don't you kick us off with that one?
Sure. I think it's been talked about on this program a couple of times about tailoring your message for the audience and the different personas within FinOps. And so I want to walk through a couple of those personas and what they may be looking at when they're looking at the curve, the cost and usage data, and when you're having those discussions about your cloud costs. And so first, kicking it off with finance. So if you're dealing with the finance folks, most likely they're looking at the full P&L impact of your costs. So that's going to be including any RI savings plan benefits, if you have any internal billing mechanisms. Basically, they're trying to answer what is the cloud costing us at the end of the day. This is what we're booking to our general ledger. And so related to that are going to be your accounting persona. So they're going to look at balance sheet management. If you have any additional prepays, if your company does amortize any prepays, what is the amortization schedule? So they're not looking as much at usage versus commitments and the on-demand, so they can book any journal entries. And then procurement related with that is going to be kind of long-term cash forecasts for the tracking of any commitments that you may have. Also issuance of new purchase orders. So they're the ones looking at, if you have a purchase order, how much is left? When do you think you're going to hit that commitment? When do we need to re-up that purchase order? Jeff, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of like the engineering tech side of when they're looking at cloud costs, what might be the key factors there?
Yeah, I think one thing is like, how do the different configurations and services affect both the cost and performance, like from a technical aspect. So performance is usually the focus. Engineers also play a critical role in identifying some of those cost-saving opportunities through things like automation, load balancing, right sizing of resources to sort of match the actual usage. But at the end of the day, to me, a lot of the KPIs and a lot of the metrics that the engineers are caring about are things like response time and things like latency and things like downtime of application. But those things are tied to cost as well, and everything sort of gets wrapped up in this nice, pretty picture in the curve. And they're much more focused on the usage-based piece and less focused on the cost, which part of that is part of the FinOps journey, right? We want everybody to speak that same language and understand what motivates each other, and getting down to the bottom of what each stakeholder actually cares about at the end of the day is one of the most important pieces of FinOps and cloud financial management.
So thinking about kind of when you're hosting these discussions or what you might be talking about as a FinOps person where you're doing this every day, how often are all of these personas in the same room? Or is this something that you generally see folks having to kind of code switch between or message to different subsets?
I have two different answers, and I'll go first. From when I was a customer, before I was in this role, I would say that it was mostly finance and engineering. I had less interaction with accounting and procurement, but when we stood up our Cloud Center of Excellence, we tried to get as many people in the same room as possible to understand and to get those foundational building blocks of what everyone cares about and what the message needs to be. But it's less of, in my opinion, the accounting and procurement and more of the finance, the engineering, and the tech, at least in that core group. Now, when I work here at AWS, it tends to be a little bit more siloed. Like I'll either have a conversation with a FinOps practitioner, with a developer, with an engineer, and to the executives. Like it's less of like this big group and it's more isolated. So in some ways, I think it's more important now more than ever in our current roles to be able to differentiate what messaging and what pieces of data are going to land, because we have to kind of come up with that beforehand.
Yeah, it's a great example of, some of the silos that I've come across in this role as well. And the challenge is, a lot of the central FinOps teams, especially if they're sitting entirely on the tech side, and even if they're very finance driven, some of those roles may have been prior finance moved over into this center of excellence, but there's still someone within the company that is booking journal entries, doing variance analysis from that traditional financial aspect, and they're not always in the conversations that I'm seeing. And so one of the things I've tried to drive those conversations and bringing everyone together, because that's where we're seeing success, because they start to realize what the other person needs out of these discussions. But I think it does depend on, if you do have that cloud center of excellence, the central FinOps, of how involved are they in some of the more traditional finance aspects, or how removed they may be.
That's a good point. Go ahead, Savannah. You first.
I was going to say, Jeff, you bring up a really good point, and it's something that's incredibly critical to keep in mind, especially if you are more familiar with the technical side. A lot of the tooling that we use to see AWS costs, a lot of the reporting that we use isn't always completely accessible for everybody if they're coming from a different background. And the data elements that we present aren't always the most intuitive either, right? So it's important, if you are delivering some sort of report or talking about a certain spend trend, to think about who you're talking to. And if they've got a finance background, they're probably a lot more comfortable with Excel than they are with Cost Explorer. Probably less prone to understanding what a bucket is and what like gets and puts mean. So making sure that that's made really clear in those communications if you are flagging something, or if you're describing how spend changed, is critical. Sorry, Jeff Bloom, go ahead.
The only other thing I was going to add is I think that's another good call out, is where the stakeholders and the data sort of like intersect, like what matters to each one. And you can break it down even further than just the 4 big buckets of personas that we went over. I'm even talking about like in engineering or in tech. One example, right, is whenever I was working in this role prior to coming to AWS, I was the one having the different conversations and trying to be like the person kind of connecting the dots for everybody. So I would have a lot of conversations with the different stakeholders. I would go into the security director's office, and the very first thing you see is this massive monitor with a map of the world, and it has all these different pings around threat detection. It's pretty easy to say, I know what matters to the security guy, right? Like that's the number one thing. Where are the threats coming from? Where are we trying to be like cyber attacked from? Where's the threat detection? What IP addresses? Like he cares about that. you go and talk to individual developers, maybe they care about just how fast can I provision the resources. I need to be able to test. I need to be able to code. I don't want to wait 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks to rack and stack. I want to provision it now. Obviously, a benefit of AWS and the cloud in general. How fast can I release new features? Yeah. And then if you're talking to an executive, maybe it's how fast can we like deploy this new application? How fast can we have some time to market releases? How agile can we be? Those are the things that you really need to get down to. I get the very base level and thinking, what do these stakeholders actually care about? And then you can sort of think through the data, the sources, and how am I going to present this in a meaningful way? And then also who needs to be in the room whenever we have these consistent conversations, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, however frequent you're having them. Let's get everybody on the same page. Let's all get an understanding. Let's all learn from each other. And then if you can tailor the message to what someone is like in their top 1, 2, 3 priorities, they're going to be more apt to receiving the message too. And they're going to care more. They're going to be more personally invested.
And even I like the idea of the message and what they're looking at, because that can also become a challenge of in our roles of efficiency, optimization, and getting people to take action as well of what they what do they care about with the data, with the usage. And I mean, you hear it, countless, someone will say from an engineering tech, standpoint, my VP may not care as much if I go over budget. They care if the application doesn't scale. So I'm going to have a giant, instance or whatever I'm looking at. And so efficiency may not necessarily be their key concern of it. So, you can have a bit of that natural tension there. And so just sharing those best practices, understanding, what is their goal of the application, and, severely over provision is probably not the best practice. What can we do better so we can have a more efficient use of our resources that still meets the requirements that they're looking for in terms of scaling and response time?
Absolutely. We've got a question in the chat here that I want to highlight. What successes have you guys both seen across customers in bridging the gaps between these various roles, tech versus non-tech? This is a good one.
This is a good one. I'll take this one first. I think that some of the biggest customer successes that I've seen, whether it's us trying to help stand this up or a customer standing this up on their own, is getting some of that executive sponsorship. It's much easier when you have executives, when you have those higher level folks in the room driving a discussion and mandating things need to be done, than it is like doing the bottoms up, right, of some individual developers going and saying, hey, you know what, maybe FinOps is the right thing to do, and kind of working that up the chain. Certainly seen that whenever I was trying to build my own FinOps team. It's something that it's much easier to say, hey, Mr. Platform Director, this is what the CIO said, this matters. And he'll say, oh yeah, or she'll say, hell yeah, that matters, versus coming to them and not having that executive sponsorship and saying, costs aren't a concern for me. Is it possible? Yes, but it's much easier if you have the executive sponsorship. So I think that piece is really key in getting that set up.
And continuing with that, the communication aspect of having regular engagements between the tech and non-tech personas can't be overstated, the importance. And I've seen customers where I've been in a meeting with them and maybe explaining an aspect from a more financial standpoint. Finance asks the question. Finance side, they're sitting there nodding the head. Everything resonates with them, and tech is just like, I had no clue, whether it was the timing of forecast and all the activities to get a forecast in, and so why the timelines were, or just the amortization schedule and why there were variances to Cost Explorer that they may have seen. And so just having that communication, so they're really understanding, oh, this is why finance is saying that, or this is why tech is saying that, has been huge.
Absolutely. I think transparency in general, and I mean that in multiple different senses, is really key. If you don't have some sort of cost transparency that's universal across the organization, you're going to be looking at different things and comparing apples to oranges. But transparency, Jeff D, and what you said around timelines or dates that matter to different folks is also a really big one. So if there's a big launch going on and finance is not aware of it and suddenly sees the cost starting to spike up, their first reaction is probably going to be panic, where that might be completely expected and completely normal. And on the flip side, if every engineering budget owner is suddenly getting a bunch of pings when they close the fiscal year or close a quarter, and they weren't aware that that was happening, that might seem like something else is wrong or something's going on there. So that clear communication and just an understanding of both sides of the world, or however many sides of the world you got in the pot, so to speak, is really key to make sure everybody's kind of understanding and on the same page.
I have a follow-up question for both of you. Of the personas, this is a little bit of a challenging question. I don't mean to put you on blast by any means, but who's the most difficult persona to convince that the other side's opinion and those key pieces of information are relevant?
I feel like that depends more on personality than persona, at least in my experience. If you have like a base level of curiosity about the cloud framework or kind of the playground that you're playing on, I feel like it's never really been too much of an issue. It's the folks who are either very structured or have, I guess, like very stringent regulations that they have to abide by that usually take a little bit more warming up to kind of break down those barriers.
I think, at least, personally, coming from the finance side, the imposter syndrome is real, of being in the conversations with the tech side. And so making sure I'm understanding the impacts of the tech decisions. And so going back to the curiosity aspect of the different roles, me wanting to learn more about tech and what they're doing, and then finding someone on the other side that is wanting to do the same, to have a finance 101 of just some base concepts of, this is how the data gets aggregated up, but all the details are in another system. So this is why I ask a question this way versus a different way. But getting someone that on the other side that you can bridge the gap is pretty important.
With all of that said, if you guys make me switch to a Mac and I get rid of my Excel keyboard shortcuts, I'm going to be that person, and I'm going to be quite grumpy quite quickly. So
we'll just set you up a workspace. There's a workaround. We'll get that fixed.
Oh, that's so much clicking. Kind of on that theme, I know we talked a good amount about KPIs when we were kind of brainstorming. Have you guys seen certain personas gravitate more towards a certain kind of KPI, or how have you seen these groups work together to create some sort of tracking mechanism and some indicators that kind of help bridge those gaps a little bit and make sense for everybody?
Yeah, I think just getting started with a KPI, it can be overwhelming of choosing what is the right one when you're starting from scratch. So it's almost choosing one. Let's start measuring it. Let's get that routine of what we're looking at. On the finance side, it's going to be a lot of the unit cost metrics are going to be key. What is your cost per vCPU hours, cost per terabyte, petabyte, whatever volume that you have. And then if you're looking to have implement tagging or other governance, perhaps looking at the total cost of untagged resources, so people understand impacts of those decisions as well. And so, if you have some of those finance, the unit cost KPIs, then you can start looking one level down of, any savings plan, RI benefits, and the impacts of those. So you can kind of tell the story of, our unit cost is going down, but maybe our volume is going up. So, now we can bring finance and tech into those conversations to understand what's going on with growth, and then how else we can we can help be more efficient with the cost aspect of it. Yeah, Jeff, for the engineering ones, what are ones, that may not be, the unit cost that you've looked at, or some of the more bespoke unit metrics?
Yeah, I think that part of the piece of it, I mentioned some earlier about like response time and latency and downtime, but I think some of the metrics that matter are still things like resource utilization, and some of these things have a big hand in cost too. The cost of running idle resources, making engineering changes like moving to Graviton, that cost, the usage-based optimizations and auto-scaling efficiency and data transfer costs, like actually getting into the weeds and seeing some of those more technical usage metrics are the things that the engineers should have the most visibility into. Of course, there are things that kind of go outside the scope of just cost, but I think it plays a role because when you do the more technical optimizations, when you're doing those efficiency optimizations and the engineering optimizations, has a heavy hand in playing a part of the cost picture. And then finance, and if you have a FinOps team or a finance team, whoever's buying the savings plans, you need to do those engineering optimizations. Ideally, you do them first. That way you can get those done, run as efficiently as you can just based on the usage. Then you can start to tie in some of the commitment level purchase options, whether it be a savings plan or a reserved instance. Those are the things I think that matter more, the technical aspect of it.
This is maybe kind of a weird question. How much have you seen KPIs differ between the groups based on customer structure? Because I know everybody manages their business differently, right? So in organizations where tech and finance manage different parts of the optimization journey, do we see that Venn diagram look more like two circles, or what are the KPI structures?
I think that to me, I think it's less of that and more of where you are in the FinOps journey. And I'm thinking more of like crawl, walk, and run. Like if you're just starting out, you're probably looking at, let's just get something, right? Let's just do some basic KPI. Like what's my total AWS spend for the last month? What's my cost per service? And then as you kind of mature this out, depending on whoever's running it, as everybody kind of builds up these foundational pieces, you kind of go into the more advanced metrics where it's just getting beyond cost and usage metrics, and you start to tie in some of those business drivers too. So depending on if you're a rideshare company or if you're a travel company, like different things are driving your business, you want to start tying in those cost and usage metrics to your business drivers. I think that's been the big differentiator for me. Is you'll see customers who are just starting out in FinOps, just trying to get a handle on some KPIs and say, let's try and do something. Let's visualize something. Let's put something in front of our stakeholders. Let's start small and kind of snowball into some of the bigger picture type activities that are really what is driving the business, but can take a little while to build that process out.
Yeah, and that's the business driver or the business unit KPIs. Those are always going to be a challenge because not only bringing in business information, but you have to understand from a tech perspective of the logical next step or what if scenarios. What if we doubled our user base, whatever that metric, to the cost scale linear? Or are there certain services that we've over provisioned and becomes a step function? And so the communication of doing like a business case, if you're trying to use that for any sort of forecasting or scenario planning, becomes critically important of, this metric that we have, how does it relate to our cost from a future perspective?
And for folks who are just getting started with that, what questions would you guys suggest that they keep in mind when they're starting to ideate on what they're going to track and how they're going to think about that?
I think it probably ties back to the earlier part of the conversation about what matters to each stakeholder, like who you're talking to, and pulling that data together. And like I said, with starting small, take something simple, right? Don't try to boil the ocean and come up with all the best metrics right off the bat. Like just start small, pick something easy, pick something that you can pull from, whether maybe it's a simple cost explorer graph, maybe it's something you can pull in and say, let's just see what that total AWS spend is. Let's see what the cost per EC2, normalized instance hour is. Let's just see what our reserved instance and savings plan coverage and utilization are. Things that are easy and pre-built, or if not pre-built, then you can get to it with, maybe a 30-minute learning session. You can start pulling this stuff in just a handful of minutes, and then you can kind of build off of that. So just start small.
I think sharing the success as well. So as you start to measure those, or say that you don't have them now, you've just implemented, but you purchased a savings plan 3 months ago, sharing that success of, this is what it was before we purchased, and look, we did this, this commitment, and look how it dropped after that, to get people used to having the conversation of, the cloud is dynamic. The decisions you make impact real time in the costs. And so people being able to build on the success of some of those initial steps of, look how much we're saving. Let's annualize it out. We've saved X amount of money. Get people excited about, what else can we do? What other services can we either have a commitment, or maybe some of that low hanging fruit, so you get people excited about that journey.
I would say, building off of that as well, anything that you can do, especially if it is a little bit more siloed between tech and finance, to highlight how any sort of collaboration can really augment the savings and kind of force multiply them, right? So if tech worked really hard on doing some sort of instance modernization or moving to Graviton, and finance purchased a selection of savings plans on top of that, showing both of those steps and how both of those are contributing to the savings kind of helps folks understand the different pieces at play there, and who's involved and how they can work together.
Yeah, that and some of those, I've tend to heard, central levers versus local levers. So trying to help people understand, what are the potential optimization that can be done centrally, which are mainly going to be your commitment based ones, versus the local. So centrally, as a FinOps or whoever happens to be, purchasing the savings plans, especially as you get to a point of higher coverage, that allow you have the story of, there's limited remaining potential because we've got a really good coverage. We've got a handle on our kind of consistent base. So local teams, we need you to take that next step to implement some of these levers. And that's exactly what, you mentioned Savannah. Then you can show, here's where we would have been. Here's where we are with the commitment based. Hey, I see you doing work in Graviton migration. Let's continue that, and using that as a way to say we can continue to drive efficiencies, but it's going to need local efforts versus the central levers. Absolutely.
All right, we got 2 minutes left. Folks in the chat, if you have any last questions, please drop them in. Jeff's, do you have any key takeaways or any last thoughts for the folks before we sign off? Jeff D, I'll come to you first since we started with Jeff B.
I think that you nailed it with the curiosity standpoint, the continuing learning of the what the different personas, the people that you interact with, and trying to have that person that you can ring up on the other side. If you have that question of, I heard this term, I read about this, someone mentioned in a meeting, can you give me a 101 explanation of what does that mean to me? And so building those relationships within your company, so you don't feel a judgment aspect if you feel it maybe is a simplistic question, but you can continue to grow your knowledge.
Yeah, I think the communication is the key across the different stakeholders. The more you can communicate, and especially if you're starting up a FinOps team or some sort of CCOE initially, I think over communicating and having those conversations more frequently are going to benefit you more than having them just monthly or just quarterly. So the more frequent that you can have the communication and bridge those gaps, and like I +1 to learning from each other and being curious and trying to really understand and learn from each other.
Didn't mean for this to turn into an LP conversation, but here we are.
It always relates back to those.
Always.
Always. All right. Well, thank you both so much for being here. It was lovely talking to you. And for folks watching, catch us next week, same time, same place. Have a good one.
See ya.
All right.